lovely to be with you again today. And today we're going to be looking at 10 objects from the British Museum, which I have classed as superstar objects. Some of them you will recognise straight away, others you might be less familiar with. All of the objects that we're going to talk about today are on public display. So when the museum reopens, you will be able to go to the museum and see each of these objects in our permanent galleries. Now, the British Museum has over 8 million objects. Only about 10% of those objects are ever on display at any one time. Some of the objects are on what we call rotation. These are particularly objects of an organic nature. Anything that's on paper or fabric can only be out on display for a certain number of days in any one year because of light levels and fading. We also have some objects, some of which appear in our talk today, which have been on almost continuous permanent display since they arrived at the British Museum, one of them 200 years ago. So I'm going to launch my PowerPoint. So I will just pull up my screen share and I will turn off my camera. We will start our slideshow from the beginning. There we go. I will, as usual, pick up my laser pointer and you can still see me, can't you? I need to, there we go. Right, let's concentrate on those beautiful museum objects. So as I say, 10 famous objects we're going to be talking about today. And what I also want to include during the talk about each object is a bit of information about how we currently understand that object, what it's telling us about the period during which it was made, but also a little bit about how it actually got to the museum. Now, I like to always think that any object has 3 stages to its life. The first stage is when that object is made and has a function, a role within the society or the community who made it. The second part of its story is when it then goes out of active circulation and becomes part of the archaeological record. This may mean that it's buried, it's hidden from view. It may mean that it remains in view, but is no longer part of people's everyday lives and everyday belief systems. A good example of this would be Stonehenge. Stonehenge has never been lost, but it certainly was no longer part of a prehistoric form of community and religious life as it moved then into medieval and early modern times. Then an object goes into the third part of its life, and this is when it re-enters active engagement from the community and from society as it moves into a museum, or in the case of Stonehenge, a heritage site, and people start to use that object and view that object and study that object to gain an understanding of the past. So all of the 10 objects we're looking at today, we're looking at them in terms of what they tell us about the past, but we're also going to be talking a little bit about their initial function and then that second stage, how they actually then took that journey to arrive at the British Museum. And the first object we're going to begin with is probably the most famous object at the British Museum, the Rosetta Stone. Now, the Rosetta Stone, you can see it here as it is on display in Gallery 4, and it's been on display for over 200 years. And according to museum records, it is the most visited single object on display, usually surrounded by a large crowd of people, most of them taking photos. The Rosetta Stone itself is a stele. It's a granite stele, and it is inscribed with 3 versions of a decree, an official announcement, issued in Egypt in 196 BC on behalf of King Ptolemy V. So this is like a stone poster, a stone notice board with a permanent message inscribed on it for everyone to see. And in terms of this message, the same message is written 3 times. In the upper part, it is written in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic script, which was the official announcement script used by pharaohs and priests. It's what you find inscribed in tombs and on temples. It's a bit like, I would say, capital letters nowadays. Signs usually are written in capital letters. So it's an ancient Egyptian formal script. The middle script is then ancient Egyptian demotic script, which is a type of hieroglyphic script used for everyday writing. So it's more of what we nowadays would call a lowercase or joined up handwriting. It's far less formal and was used for legal documents, and correspondence could be handwritten and also inscribed, as it is on the Rosetta Stone. And then the bottom writing is ancient Greek, which was used for formal information at the time. By the time we get to the creation of the Rosetta Stone, we are looking at the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, who have Hellenistic, a Greek heritage, and ancient Greek is one of the other formal languages alongside Middle Egyptian being used in the kingdom. And the decree has only minor differences between the 3 versions, which makes it so important when it came to deciphering the Egyptian scripts, the demotic and in particular the hieroglyphic script at the top. Now, the stone was probably originally displayed in a temple, and it was moved out of this temple in late antiquity. And this was probably when the top section of the stone broke off, because the stone we see nowadays is not the complete object. During that second part of its life, as it was taken out of the temple, out of active circulation in society, it was broken. And experts think that originally the Rosetta Stone would have been much larger and would have had a rounded top, and that there would have been more hieroglyphic script with a carved panel at the top showing the pharaoh and different deities. None of the missing parts of the stone have ever been found. What happened is that the broken stone, with or without the missing parts, ended up being used as building material in the foundation of a military fort near the town of Rosetta in the Nile Delta. And this was where it was discovered in July 1799 by a French officer during the Napoleonic campaigns in Egypt, because Napoleon had taken military infrastructure to Egypt, hoping to make it part of the French Empire, but also took scholars to record the remains of the ancient Egyptian civilization in the country. When it was found, it was taken to Cairo and was actually inspected by Napoleon himself. So if you go down to the British Museum and stand in Gallery 4 and look at the Rosetta Stone, you are looking at something that Napoleon himself once looked at. The British defeated the French and they took the stone to London under a treaty known as the Treaty of Alexandria in 1801. And this meant that all of the objects that the French scholars had found during their military campaign in Egypt were given to the British. The stone was given to King George III, who gave it to the British Museum, where it's been on public display since 1802. It's actually been off display only twice. Once in 1917, when the museum was worried about heavy bombing in London, and the stone was moved for 2 years down to the postal tube railway system at Mount Pleasant near Holborn. And then later in 1972, it travelled for 1 month to be displayed as part of an exhibition about deciphering hieroglyphs, ironically at the Louvre in Paris. So it went back to the French for a month, but it's now back in London, where it continues on public display. The pharaoh for whom the decree was written was Ptolemy V. And here we have a small limestone statue of Ptolemy V. And originally there would have been a wig made from darker stone slotted into the column at the back. And what we have remaining is the front part of the bust showing Ptolemy himself. And the decree was issued 1 year after Ptolemy had become pharaoh. He became pharaoh at the age of 13 years. And the decree is swearing allegiance to the pharaoh and support from priests in ancient Egypt. So they are basically announcing their support for the new boy pharaoh. And it's the fact that this decree was issued in the 3 different scripts, 2 different languages, Egyptian and Greek, but 3 different scripts, that allowed it to be used for deciphering the hieroglyphs. The script in ancient Greek, slightly different to modern Greek, but a language which was understood by scholars in Victorian times when the Rosetta Stone arrived. And it was the fact that the ancient Greek, which was very quickly translated once the stone had been discovered and put on display, that enabled scholars to do comparisons with the ancient Greek and the other 2 scripts. So for example, looking for the name Ptolemy in the ancient Greek version, you can see Ptolemy written using the ancient Greek alphabet. The positioning of the name could then be compared with the hieroglyphic script, which had an additional clue, because being the name of a pharaoh, the word Ptolemy was surrounded by what we call a cartouche, which looks like an oval, a bit like a lasso around the pharaoh's name. And that meant that the signs being used to sound out Ptolemy could be compared with the sounds that they knew were being made by the ancient Greek alphabet, and then compared with how Ptolemy's name was written in the Demotic, the everyday script used for recording the Middle Egyptian spoken language. So working out from Ptolemy's name over the next couple of decades, scholars were able to start to decode, decipher the sounds of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic script. And this meant that in 1822, hieroglyphs were finally translated, working in association with other scholars who'd been working on the script over the years as well. And it was finally translated by Jean-François Champollion, a French scholar. Now, following this, 3 further fragments of the same decree were discovered later, and additional bilingual and trilingual scripts are now known. So the Rosetta Stone is no longer unique, but because of its role as the first trilingual inscription to arrive in a museum setting, and the copying of that inscription, which was then circulated to museums and universities in Europe, it is the key to our modern understanding of ancient Egyptian literature and civilization. So from the Rosetta Stone, we now move to our second famous superstar. And if any of you have been watching Netflix, you might well have recently seen the film The Dig, which tells the story of the discovery of our next superstar, Sutton Hoo, and specifically the Sutton Hoo ship burial. Now, Sutton Hoo is a piece of high land on the eastern bank of the River Durban near Woodbridge in Suffolk. Sutton itself is quite a common place name. It quite simply means south, and it comes from the Anglo-Saxon word sut, southern farmhouse or village. And then the Who means spur of a hill, so refers to the fact that Sutton Hoo is high above the river. Now, burial sites had been discovered at Sutton Hoo, some of which had been robbed, since the 1600s. And in Victorian times, a rudimentary investigation was carried out on some of the burial sites, which were recorded in the Ipswich newspaper as Roman mounds or barrows. And one of the smaller barrows was opened up in 1860, and a considerable amount of iron screw bolts were found in the mound. From our point of view, this is obviously an indication that the mound had at some point probably had a smaller ship burial in it, and these were the rivets that joined the boards of the ship together. What happened in Victorian times was, having discovered these iron bolts, they were then taken to the local blacksmith to be converted into horseshoes. With the main ship burial in Mound 1, the objects having been discovered then arrived at the British Museum, where they are currently on display in room 41. They're set out in the central case. They were originally planned to mark out the length and the shape of the ship burial on the floor of the gallery, to give visitors an idea of how large the ship was and an idea of where the individual objects were found in the ship. When they started to measure it out, they realised that the gallery was too small. The ship was actually much longer than the length of the gallery, but the case does try to lay out to some extent the orientation and the position of the different objects within the central part of the ship. This modern excavation of the site began in 1938, when the landowner, Mrs. Edith Pretty, employed the Suffolk excavator Basil Brown, who worked for Ipswich Museum, to open 3 of the mounds on her land. Mounds 2 and 3 were opened in 1938, and then Mound 1 was opened in 1939, and this is where the ship burial itself was discovered. As it became apparent that Mound 1 contained a large ship burial and was likely to contain archaeological objects, because disturbance of the mound had gone no further than a small shaft set into the top of the mound, and the objects being right at the base of the mound had not been uncovered. The archaeological team then grew to include archaeologists from the British Museum. And the first piece of gold found in the burial chamber was uncovered by archaeologist Peggy Piggott, who had trained at the Institute of Archaeology at UCL. And she also excavated the Great Gold Belt. These are some of the objects on display. We have the purse lid, and we have some shoulder clasps. Now, the purse lid is a good example of where survival of objects from Sutton Hoo, because of the acidity of the sandy soil in that part of Suffolk, means that organic materials such as leather and fabric and wood did not survive, but what did remain were the metal parts of the objects. Gold itself is an incredibly inert metal. It does not react with the soil around it, and therefore survives literally thousands of years in the soil. You then have silver. Some of the other objects were made from silver. You have bronze. And then finally, there were some iron pieces, which were quite badly corroded because of the acid and the damp on the site, but had survived enough to be recovered and brought to the museum. When you go to the museum, you'll see that some of the objects with organic materials, such as the shield, the metal pieces are original. The leather shield itself is a reconstruction to give a better understanding to the audience of how the pieces would have been placed originally. That leather has long rotted away and was never recovered. There were attempts to establish whether there was a body in the burial. No remains of a body were ever found, but later investigation on the site during the 1980s meant that they were able to use more advanced scientific techniques which enabled them to find trace elements which indicate that there probably was a body buried as part of the ship burial, but it did not survive due to the acidic nature of the soil. Now, these objects, when they were recovered from the ship burial, were given by Mrs. Pretty to the British Museum, where they arrived and went straight into secure storage. They arrived at the start of World War II, so they went straight down into the London Underground. Some of them still wrapped in the local moss that had been used to pack them in apple boxes in Suffolk. And then after the war, research began on the objects. Reconstructions such as the leather shield, and there's also a wooden bucket, were then put on display in the gallery, Gallery 41, where they have been on continuous display ever since. A number of the objects do travel and they go on rotation up to the National Trust Visitors Centre, Sutton Hoo now being managed by the National Trust. This is Sutton Hoo itself, and you can quite clearly see the River Deben down below, with the town of Woodbridge opposite, and then the burial site here on the headland of the spur of land jutting out next to the river. And this is a large Anglo-Saxon cemetery. It's a large burial ground, and each of these mounds represents a burial, each of them in different states of survival. Some of them having been quite badly disturbed, such as the one we heard about earlier, where all the iron rivets were taken in Victorian times and melted down. Sutton Who is this mound 1 here at the back of the site, and you can actually see the dip in the top reflecting where the soil has settled when the ship burial was filled back in again at the end of the 1930s. You can see the pathways that the National Trust has cut for visitors to walk around the site, and then further over to the edge would have been Tranmere House, where Mrs. Pretty lived. The photo at the bottom is a photograph taken in 1939 of the excavation. We have Mrs. Pretty standing at the back here, observing. We have Basil Brown down in the ship itself, excavating. And here you can see the pattern on the soil, which was all that remained of the ship's rivets. They left an impression where they had rusted, corroded away due to soil acidity. And by careful excavation and by looking at different colours and textures in that soil, they were able to reconstruct the shape and the size of the original ship. Now, the ship didn't have a functioning keel, and there was a lot of debate about whether it would ever have held a sail. And it's thought that it was specially built for the burial, and it would have been dragged up from the River Deben, up the side of the hill, dragged into a trench cut in the ground, so in a sort of soil dry dock, and then a burial chamber, rather like a small garden shed, was built in the middle of the ship, and this is where the burial objects were recovered. Here is the great gold buckle, which was excavated by Peggy Piggott, and here we can actually see it in the ground as part of that central burial chamber being excavated. The objects, as we say, were then taken to the British Museum, went into storage, came out of storage for conservation and research, and are now on display in Gallery 41. The next object we're going to be looking at is also on display in the upper part of the British Museum, and this time it is not one object but a collection of objects known as the Vinderlander Tablets. And the Vinderlander Tablets date from Roman Britain times, and they were excavated at Vinderlander Fort in northern England. The fort was built around AD 85 to help control the northern frontier. 40 years later, Hadrian's Wall was built, and although Vinderlander was not actually on the wall, it was slightly south of the wall, it became one of the wall forts between Housesteads and Great Chester. And we can see excavation of Vinderlander, which is owned, the site is owned by a private trust. And we can see next to it one of the Vinderlander tablets recovered from this site. Now, the Vinderlander tablets are actually very thin pieces of wood cut from young birch, alder, or oak trees, which grew locally. And they were used as a writing surface for quick notes. They are almost what you would call Roman post-it notes. They weren't meant to survive very long. They include personal letters, official military documents, and also lists of goods at the fort. Now, the first set of tablets was found in 1973. And the reason that these wooden tablets, an organic material which you would not expect to survive in wet British soil, the reason they survived was they were found in a waterlogged rubbish heap in the corner of the fort commander's house. And what we think happened was that they were piled up, ready to be burnt, like nowadays, putting your documents through the shredder. These official reports and these informal letters would be gathered up periodically and burnt to destroy them. What happened was that they went onto the bonfire, but it rained, the bonfire was put out, not all the tablets had been burnt through, and then over time soil built up over them, and because they were in a corner at a right angle between two stone walls, the groundwater, water table, meant that the soil below, around and above them was very often waterlogged, and it was that waterlogging that enabled them to survive. Because in a waterlogged situation, they were almost sealed, and therefore their condition did not change. They could not rot away as they would have been if they'd been exposed to the open air. The text was written with a reed pen using ink made from carbon and gum water. And the tablets, as we can see on this one, were folded to protect the writing. And sometimes they would have holes punched in the corners so that several of them could be joined together with string, a bit like those concertina postcards you get at the seaside. The tablets are themselves about the size of a large postcard, and the ones at the British Museum on display in room 49 all date from around AD 92 to 105, so quite early on in Roman Britain. And we know at this time that the troops garrisoned, stationed at Vinderlander, were auxiliary troops from mainland Europe in the areas that we now know as Belgium and the Netherlands. And here we have two examples of tablets from the Vinderlander collection. The one at the top is a collection of goods, and it's a tablet, a double tablet. You can see where it would have been folded, and it's written in 3 columns. First column, second column, which actually straddles the join between the 2 tablets, and then a third column. And this is actually a list of goods, and it has names, goods, and amounts of money under 2 headings. And it appears to be soldiers from the century of Eusebius and the century of Tullio. So those would have been the commanding officers. And the goods listed include overgarments, pepper, tallow, towels, thongs, items of footwear. And they appear to be transactions, items being bought by soldiers from a local civilian merchant, using their salary to buy everyday items to augment their life in the fort and to buy in objects that were not necessarily supplied by the army. The second tablet just below is actually shown as an infrared photograph, which is why it has no colour. And this is because a lot of the tablets, the writing started to fade as soon as they were taken out of their waterlogged situation. As soon as they started to dry out, so the ink started to dry and fade, and so the tablets themselves started to dry and buckle and crack. And all of the tablets that we have on display have now shrunk and are smaller than they would have been originally, as the wood dried out under very controlled circumstances in our laboratories, so they shrunk. But photographing them with infrared allows experts to look at the text written on the tablets. It's written in Latin, in what is called cursive Latin. It's not technically cursive because the letters aren't joined up. More, I think, a case of what, again, we would call lowercase letters being used. And this second tablet is a leave request written asking the prefect of the century to grant leave to one of the soldiers. It was purchased from the Vinderlander Trust, which, as I said, is a private organisation, and it was purchased with a contribution from the Eyre Family Foundation, which gave over £14,500 to the purchase of tablets for the museum collection. And 21 of these tablets are now on display in the museum, and a large number of them are also still in storage, very often in fragments. And here again, we look back to the idea that only 10% of our objects are on display. What tends to be on display are the most complete examples of any type of object that we have. So the best Vinderlander tablets are out for everyone to see. The next object we're going to look at is on display in Gallery 25, the Africa Gallery, and this object is known as the Ife Head. It's a copper alloy casting. It's about 600 years old and comes from 13th or 14th century West Africa. It probably depicts Uni, who was a king of the West African kingdom of Ife. Ife emerged around AD 800 and was one of several West African kingdoms that developed at this time. And the power and the wealth of the kingdom of Ife was partly derived from its access to lucrative trade via the Niger River, which then connected the kingdom to wider networks across West Africa and down into sub-Saharan Africa. And we can see that the head is hollow cast. And if we look at the back, we can see that the center of the cast is hollow. It is the face of King Uni, and it is designed in a very naturalistic style. The face itself is slightly elongated and has vertical incised markings, striations, running from the forehead down to the nose and around the chin. In addition, there are small holes set in a line running from ear to ear and also underneath the jaw. And around the neck, there are 4 grooves which represent skin creases on the neck. The head is adorned with a crown composed of layers where the copper alloy is intended to represent tube-shaped beads and tassels. And these bead shapes are meant to represent the beads that were to form part of the king's regalia now cast in bronze, and they are what we call in archaeology a skeuomorph, i.e. they are one material, metal, intended to look like another material, in this case, glass or coral beads. And then on top, there is a plume, slightly bent. This is how it was recovered from the ground. So it was bent as it went into the ground. And the surface of the Ife Head still retains small amounts of both red and black paint, particularly on the crown. The head was found in 1938 in Nigeria, which at that time was a British colony. And it was found during house building works. It was found with 16 other heads and the upper part of a figure. Most of the objects found in the compound and neighbouring areas ended up in the National Museum of Ife, but a few left Nigeria and now are in the collections of European and American museums. Now, the British Museum's Ife Head, the one we see before us, was initially purchased by Mr. Bates, who was the editor of the Daily Times of Nigeria. And then in 1939, it was bought for the British Museum by Sir Kenneth Clarke, Director of the National Gallery, who was acting on behalf of the National Art Collections Fund. Now, the discovery of these sculptures was a spur for the Nigerian government to control exports of antiquities. Before this was achieved, some of the heads had left the country, and this head had made its way to London via Paris. Two others went to America. And then in 1938, successfully, legislation was passed by the colonial authorities, which meant that it was now illegal to export material recovered from archaeological sites in Nigeria out of the country. Now, the head itself was made using the wax lost cast method. We'll have a greater look at that in a moment. But first of all, I just want to point you to this photograph on the left-hand side of the screen, because this shows us some of the other heads which are now on display in Nigeria. When they came over to the British Museum, they were loaned to the British Museum in 1948, when the Department of Conservation and Scientific Research made plaster casts of the heads which are in Nigeria. And this is an example of one of those plaster casts that was made by the British Museum in the late 40s. It corresponds in size to the original copper alloy casting and has been painted green to pick up the patination of the original metal. And then holes have been added as they were in the original head. And it is thought that these holes might have been fixing points for additional parts of regalia added to the original heads, perhaps beadwork, which hung over the lower part of the face. Now, the heads themselves are about 3/4 life size, and they are made using the hollow cast wax technique. And what this means is that you begin with a model of the statue, the bust, the figurine that you would like to end up with. And that is made from a malleable material. In this case, it's been demonstrated as being made from clay. And this is the core. Once the core has been shaped and fashioned with all the detail, it is then covered with a layer of wax. That wax is then itself surrounded by a case of clay. So it's a bit like an Easter egg, layer upon layer upon layer, like those Russian nest dolls. Once the outer clay mould has set, it can then be heated, the wax melts and runs out. What you are then left with is a cavity, a space around the core, which can then be filled from the top with the molten metal. Once that molten metal has set, the outer case can be broken off, smashed, done away with, it has served its purpose, and the core inside can be removed to leave you with your finished hollow cast. Now, stylistic similarities across all of the heads suggests that the heads were made either by an individual artist or by a single workshop in ancient Ife. And the British Museum Ife Head was included in a 2010 exhibition, Kingdom of Ife, Sculptures from West Africa, which was developed in partnership with Nigeria's National Commission of Museums and Monuments, and also included pieces from the Museum of African Art in New York. And this exhibition was put on to mark the 50th anniversary of Nigerian independence. The next object we're going to look at comes from Oceania. This is an object on display in Gallery 25, and it is known as the Easter Island statue. It's an ancestor figure. It is made from volcanic basalt. It stands 2.5 meters tall and weighs just over 4 tons. The top of the British Museum head is flat. It originally would have supported a cylindrical stone topping. The statue itself dates from about AD 1000, and it's one of 2 large statues from Easter Island at the British Museum. These megalithic statues were often placed on ceremonial platforms and are said to be the living faces of ancestors. Easter Island itself was settled by Polynesian navigators around AD 1000. And then in 1888, the islands were annexed by Chile. Now, the statue itself was found by British explorers. And at the time when it was found, it was buried up to its shoulders in a house on the island. And it's thought that this house was the second place that the statue had stood, and that previously it was on a ceremonial platform outside before its ritual function changed. And inside the ceremonial house, the statue was associated with the Birdman religion, which developed around 1400, about 300 years after this statue was carved. Now, in 1868, the crew of the British survey ship HMS Topaz visited Easter Island, and the crew were led to the statue in November of that year. It was discovered in its house, and it was decided that it was going to be unearthed and brought back to Britain. So the stone house surrounding it was dismantled, and the statue was taken on a sledge down to the shore, dragged across the beach, and then floated out on a raft to the Topaz. And all of this was witnessed by the inhabitants of the island, one of whom later had the scene tattooed on his arm. And the Topaz arrived back in Plymouth in August 1869, and the Admiralty offered the statue to Queen Victoria, who proposed that it was given to the British Museum. In 1869, it arrived in the British Museum, and since then it has actually stood in a variety of locations around the museum building. So it's moved a bit like it originally moved on Easter Island. At one point, it was displayed outside. Here we see a photo of it in the 1930s, standing on the colonnade. During World War II, it was taken inside. And once inside, it stood in a number of locations before being moved in 1966 to the British Museum outstation, the Museum of Mankind in Burlington Gardens. When the Museum of Mankind closed in 2000, the statue came back to the museum, where it went into the Great Court. And what we can see here in this photo is a picture of it being moved from the Great Court into Gallery 24 where it stands to this day. Now, the back of the statue is carved with glyphs, symbols, which tell us about its second use as a ritual object in the Birdman religion. And the back carving has stylized beaks, which are said to represent local seabirds on the island. And there was a ceremony in association with the Birdman religion, which involved islanders every year holding a competition to retrieve the first egg laid by migrating sooty terns on the island. The person who retrieved the first egg then became the Birdman's representative on the island for the following year. And this photograph, taken in 1980 of one of the other statues still standing on the island, shows us how the British Museum statue might have first looked when it was first raised around AD 1000 on a ceremonial platform with a carved cylindrical stone balanced on the flat top, which is thought to represent either hair or a hat. The one for the British Museum statue did not survive its transfer to its second location, and therefore he stands with his flat head and no topping. Those are the first 5 objects in our tour of the British Museum superstars. We're now going to take a 10-minute break, after which we will return to look at the next 5 objects I have selected to represent famous objects from around the world on public display at the museum. Thank you, and welcome back to part 2 of our talk, where we're going to leave our 10-minute break. Oh, my slideshow always gets a little bit cross when I leave it on pause for 10 minutes. Here we go. And we move on to our next 5 objects, the first of which is the famous Parthenon sculptures. Now, the Parthenon sculptures are probably the second most visited set of objects after the Rosetta Stone. They are also an set of objects around which there is a lot of modern debate, and you'll find a statement about the Parthenon sculptures on the British Museum website. What we're going to do today is we're going to have a little look at the Parthenon sculptures as they are on display at the British Museum, and have a little look at the archaeology of how they travelled from Athens to the British Museum. And what we have here is a watercolour of the Parthenon painted by Lady Trevelyan in 1842. And it shows us that in modern times, the Parthenon has stood as a ruin on the Acropolis in Athens. In ancient times, the Parthenon was a temple dedicated to the goddess Athena. It was originally built in 447 BC, when the Athenian Empire was at its peak. It was completed in 438, although decoration of the building continued until 432 BC. Now, the Parthenon, as well as being a temple, also served as the city treasury. In AD 590, the Parthenon was converted into a Christian church dedicated to the Virgin Mary. After the Ottoman conquest of Greece, it remained as a place of worship, but was turned into a mosque during the early 1460s. Then in September 1687, an Ottoman ammunition dump inside the building was ignited by a bombardment by the Venetian forces during the siege of the Acropolis. The resulting explosion severely damaged the Parthenon and its sculptures, and really was the start of its modern history as a ruin in Athens. In 1800 to 1803, Thomas Bruce, the 7th Earl of Elgin, removed some of the surviving sculptures, and they are sometimes also referred to as the Elgin marbles. And he removed them with the permission, he said, of the ruling Turkish Ottoman authorities. Marbles were brought back to Britain, and in 1816, Elgin sold them to the British Museum for £35,000. This is considered to be well below the cost to Elgin of removing and transporting the sculptures originally, which is said to have cost him around £75,000. They were then deposited in the British Museum, where they have been on display ever since. And the sculptures themselves consist of square metopes, which was set onto the outside of the temple, on the outer wall above the outer columns. And these depict a battle between centaurs and humans, as we can see on this metope. Most of them are badly damaged. A lot of the heads are missing, as are pieces of the sculptures which are more vulnerable to breakage because they sit proud of the stone face. The other set of sculptures are the friezes, and these would have run as a continuous narrative around the inner wall of the temple above the second set of columns. And they show a parade which took part every year to commemorate the birthday of the goddess Athena, who the Athenians considered to be their patron goddess, and they thought her birthday was in August. So every August there would be a parade through the city streets, and Athena would be given her birthday gift, a new woven robe, which was carried up onto the Acropolis and put on one of the statues to Athena that stood there. And what we see in these two blocks of frieze are some of the people taking part in the horse parade, the parade of horses through the streets, and then a group of women who are carrying offerings, jugs full of liquid and dishes which would have held food, and then one woman holding a stand at the front for burning incense, all of which would have been part of the ritual libations, the offerings to Athena that would have taken part, would have been a part of her birthday celebrations. Now, the third type of sculpture that we refer to when we say the Elgin marbles or the Parthenon sculptures are the 3D sculptures, sculptures in the round. And if you go to the British Museum and you go to Gallery 18, you can actually walk up to the end of each gallery and you can do what not many visitors do, which is to walk all the way around the back of the sculptures. And these represent ancient Greek deities. And the east pediment showed the birth of Athena from the head of her father, the god Zeus. And the pediments were quite badly damaged, particularly the east pediment, during the explosion, the Ottoman explosion. And in fact, the section that showed the birth of Athena has been lost. While the museum was cleaning the sculptures in 2009, it discovered some of the ancient pigment, the paint that would originally have adorned the sculptures when they were first raised in ancient Athens 2,500 years ago. And we think that most of the statues that are now on display in the British Museum galleries would originally have been painted, and that the white or cream coloured marble which we are used to seeing nowadays is not how they would originally have been viewed in their original context. And one of the pigments which has been picked up is a pigment known as Egyptian blue. Some parts of it are discernible to the human eye, particularly after the sculptures had been cleaned in the scientific laboratories in cleaned by scientists from our laboratories in 2009. They were cleaned in the gallery, not in the laboratories. But what also happened was that the scientists used a type of infrared photography to take photos of the sculptures, and this infrared photography then highlighted, as you can see with these white patches, where there were surviving parts of the pigment, the ancient pigment, particularly Egyptian blue, still on the sculptures. And this gives us an idea of how highly coloured these sculptures would have been when they were originally raised on the Parthenon. And Egyptian blue is probably the earliest known synthetic pigment. It was first used by the ancient Egyptians, hence its name, and later by the Greeks. And if you see the Parthenon sculptures in Gallery 18, you will also see that, as well as the pigment which would have been painted on it, in various parts of the sculptures there are small drill holes. And it's thought that, as well as a painted surface, the sculptures originally would have had fixtures and fittings added to them. Specifically, the horses would have had bronze reins, and we can still see the drill holes on the horses' heads and around their necks and on the hands of some of the riders, where metal pieces were fitted onto the stone painted sculptures to add extra detail and additional 3D layers to the sculptures in their original context. The next object we're going to look at is a Roman object. It is a Roman object from Africa, and this is the Moray head. It's a bronze head depicting the first Roman emperor, Augustus, and it dates to around 25 BC. And it shows Augustus with classical Greek proportions, which are designed to idealize and flatter the emperor. And what's unusual about this particular sculpture is that the eyes have survived. The eyes are set with glass pupils and calcite, a type of white mineral, irises, and it is very rare for the inset eyes to survive on ancient sculptures. His hair is shown falling across his brow in a way that's typical of Augustan portraits, and is typical of the heads of statues, full-size statues, that would have been raised across the empire. These statues were probably made locally, but based on moulds created in Rome. And they were a way of demonstrating to peoples in territories which had become part of the Roman Empire who was now the authority in that particular area of the world. The statue itself was looted from Roman Egypt in 24 BC by the forces of the Queen of Kush. It was brought back to Kush, where it was buried beneath the staircase of a temple. Now, the kingdom of Kush was an ancient kingdom in Nubia, centered on the Nile Valley, in what is nowadays northern Sudan and southern Egypt. Now, the Romans had conquered the kingdom of Egypt under Cleopatra VII, and a border had been negotiated at modern Aswan, and the kingdom of Kush became what we call a client kingdom. It wasn't occupied by the Romans, but as an area of land on the edge of their empire, they were a client kingdom who had to pay taxes to the Romans. And this was a way of the Romans creating a buffer zone around the border of their empires to help protect the empire itself. In 1909, excavations by the University of Liverpool began in Sudan at Meroe, which was the capital of the kingdom of Kush. And then in 1914, excavations had spread south. And these excavations which spread south unearthed a small temple with a doorway flanked by two stelae. And we know from the Rosetta Stone earlier on that a stele is a piece of stone. It is a stone notice board with a public announcement engraved upon it. The bottom bit of this stele is very rough, it's not finished, and this is where it would have been set into the ground. And above it is an inscription in the ancient language of the Kingdom of Kush. And at the top, we have a picture of the Queen of Kush facing some Egyptian deities. And the inscription below is a line of 42 lines in the Moreau cursive script. Now, this alphabet consists of 15 consonants, 4 vowels, and 4 Cyrillic characters. And although the sound equivalent of the characters are known, which means you can therefore read the language out as a spoken language, the meaning of it beyond the sound is at the moment unclear. There are no bilingual inscriptions long enough, as per the Rosetta Stone, to enable this to be deciphered. And this is one of the few ancient languages which has still not yet been deciphered. But what this inscription probably tells us about is that incursion into Roman Egypt from the point of view of the Kingdom of Kush. At the moment, all our information about how the head of Augustus might have travelled from Roman Egypt into Kush all comes from Roman sources and the writings of Roman historians who give us an account of the raid. So what we know from these sources, from the Roman sources, is that the head was probably hacked off during a raid made by the Kushite army into the south of Roman Egypt. The head was probably hacked off a large statue which had been raised in honour of Augustus. And although the Roman army successfully pursued the Kushite army back into Kushite territory and reclaimed many statues, they never went as far south as the Kushite capital itself, and therefore this head was never recovered. What we do know, that having travelled into the Kingdom of Kush, this head was ceremoniously buried beneath a monumental stairway that led to an altar of victory. And the placing of the emperor's head below the shrine steps was designed to be a symbolic insult to the reputation of Augustus and the Romans in the eyes of the Kushites. And when this was first excavated, with the excavations being conducted by John Gustin of the University of Liverpool, it was found buried beneath the temple stairs in a well-preserved state. Well-preserved not only because it was metal, but because of the very hot, dry conditions of the excavation site. Eager to share his findings, Gustin shipped the head straight back to London, and the head was donated to the British Museum by the Sudan Excavation Committee, which had been responsible for Gustin's excavation in Sudan. Most of the excavation sponsorship came from wealthy Britons, including the pharmaceutical entrepreneur Henry Wellcome, founder of the Wellcome Collection up near Euston. Now, Gustin himself was a specialist in Middle Eastern and Egyptian art, and he falsely thought that the head belonged to Germanius, Augustus's great-nephew, but comparison with marble busts already held by the British Museum and coins of Augustus clearly show that this is a head of Augustus taken from Roman Egypt down into Africa. The next object we're going to look at is from modern Mexico. It is from the Aztec Empire and dates to the 15th or 16th century. It's a double-headed serpent. It's a sculpture made from turquoise pieces over a wooden base. And as well as the turquoise tiles, they have also used conch shells for the teeth, and the adhesive used to stick the teeth into the mouth of the serpent has been coloured red to give it the appearance of the red oyster shell, which is the third component making up the serpent's head mosaics. The body of the serpent is formed in a number of curves leading to the other head. And the back of the object is actually hollow. The wood that it is made from was hollowed out, probably to make it lighter in weight, and it's actually only the heads that are decorated on both sides. And it is thought that this serpent represented a sky band, a celestial serpent, which was part of the ancient Aztec religious belief system. It was also a symbol of authority, and it is thought that the serpent might have been worn as a chest ornament. Now, the two images to the right-hand side of this screen are taken from Aztec codex, which are Aztec manuscripts. These two probably created in the early 1500s, which show us ancient Aztec deity wearing a chest ornament, as this serpent was probably worn, and also including small double-headed serpents, which indicate the role of the serpent in Aztec iconography, being related to the sun and its journey across the sky. So the sun rising and the sun setting, the two-headed serpent, the two parts of the sun's journey during the day. Now, the serpent itself came to the museum on quite a circuitous journey. It was actually probably first removed from Mexico by the Spanish when they landed on the modern Mexican coast and marched to the capital city of the Aztec Empire to claim the territory for the Spanish king. And it's believed that the serpent might have been given as a diplomatic gift by Montezuma II, the Aztec ruler, to Cortes, the leader of the Spanish invasion forces. The serpent was then brought back to Europe, which is where we are able to pick up its story in more detail. Now, a lot of these objects did travel from Aztec territory back to Europe after the fall of the Aztec Empire to the Spanish authorities. And we know that some of them were taken to jewelry workshops in Florence, where they were broken up to make smaller pieces of jewelry. This one survived and is believed to have passed into the ownership of an Italian noble family. And it was probably this family who then sold it in the 1890s to the British Museum. The reason I say probably is because it's said to have come from an old collection in Rome and was sold through the agency of a lady known as the Duchess Massimo. But what is unclear is whether she was selling it on behalf of her husband's family or her own family. So it certainly was being sold by her to the British Museum, and a cheque for £120 was issued for the Duchess, and the serpent arrived at the museum. It was first exhibited at the Society of Antiquities in 1894 and is now on display in the Mexico galleries at the British Museum. Our next object is on display in room 33, and this is a copper alloy statue of the Hindu god Shiva, and it shows Shiva as Lord of the Dance, surrounded by a circular arch of flames which represent the circle of life. You'll see that he has his leg raised in an energetic dance. In his hair, there is a small personification of the river Ganges flowing through his locks, which splay out to either side as he dances. In one hand, he holds a small drum on which he beats the rhythm of life. And below his right leg, he stamps on the demon of ignorance. And this statue, like the Ife Head, was made using the lost wax technique. It's one of the examples of the Lord of the Dance artworks that have been found across the Indian subcontinent, the earliest of which probably date back to the AD 600s. This one probably dates to around AD 1100 and was made by the Tamil people of Sri Lanka, which at that point was ruled by a southern Indian dynasty. And we have examples from Indian manuscripts of the Lord of the Dance portrayed in albums which were created for the noble households of India, which were a collection of iconographies of the different Hindu deities. This particular album from which this page is taken was bought for the museum in Victorian times and was brought from the collections of the Earl of Bridgewater, who had originally purchased it from a publisher and print dealer, Thomas Rodd, whose shop was at 17 Great Newport Street, Longacre. And our last object is a very modern object, because the museum is still collecting. And this is an object which was collected in 2015, and it is an Aboriginal piece of artwork. It's a large canvas on display in room 24, just near the Easter Island statue. And this canvas is a depiction of a story from the Aboriginal dreamings. And it tells the story of the journey of a man and his son, shown as two snakes, travelling across the western desert of Australia. And the different parts of the desert landscape are represented by circles which pick up different features across the desert. They are also joined by other serpents who represent spirits from Aboriginal dreaming. And this piece was brought in 2015 from an Aboriginal art project. It was originally created in 2013 and was sold and purchased through the Art Centre in Darwin, North Australia, which represents 15 remote art projects across Northern and Western Australia. I also wanted to show you a companion piece which has snuck in as joint number 10, which sits alongside the picture we've just seen. This again is an Aboriginal artwork painted in 2013, purchased in 2015. And you'll see that on arrival at the museum, both pieces were mounted on wooden frames, which is how they are now displayed in the museum galleries. Originally, the pieces were painted directly onto the canvas, which you can see around the edge of this image before the object was mounted. And I just wanted to finish with a picture, not of a British Museum object, but of an Aboriginal painting which is currently held in an Australian museum, but two photographs which are part of the British Museum archive, which give us an idea about how these paintings were originally created by a group of Aboriginal artists who paint directly onto the canvas on the ground, and then working as a team, working on different areas of the canvas, create the final artwork, which is then rolled and sold and then mounted when it arrives in a museum. And this particular painting, the one that we have the photographs of, took 4 weeks to paint, and it was painted in the summer of 1981 It was then sold to an Australian, the National Museum of Australia, where it is currently on display. So thank you very much. I hope you have enjoyed our tour of 10 objects from the British Museum collections, a small selection of the over 8 million that we have in store. And we now have time for a few questions.
Thank you, Catherine. The first question actually is it possible to see the Aztec snake from the front again? Someone's asking. And now
yes.
It means getting the PowerPoint up again, doesn't it? No, so that's why.
Don't yes, keep talking. If there's another question.
Yes, there is another question.
Let's go back to the Aztec. Here it comes. There we are. There's the front of the Aztec serpent.
I think we're still seeing. I'm still seeing my screen. Not sure.
Oh, that's because I haven't stopped. That's because I haven't done a sharing. Right, let's see if I can share the screen.
Cool. While you're doing that, I'll let you think of the Ife heads you've shown are beautiful. Did other kingdoms in West Africa also use the same style of sculpture?
That is a very interesting question. Yes. What the Ife head is representative of is a style of African artwork from what we would call medieval Africa. It equates to what we call medieval times in Europe. So before there was contact with the European traders and settlers, and it is a type of royal artwork which would have been commissioned by the palaces at the centre of these kingdoms. So it is elite, high status artwork. And for Ife is particularly resonant for Nigeria in particular, where this metalwork, the use of copper alloys, then continued all the way through to the Benin, the Kingdom of Benin, and is also represented by the Benin bronzes. But this style of artwork is probably also representative of artwork which was occurring in medieval Africa in other materials. So we've got examples of terracotta heads and also ivory artwork. And as you can imagine, the more organic the material, so there would have been artworks in wood and in textile which have not survived. So what the Ife head allows us to do is to see an example of the type of rich artwork that would have been extant across medieval Africa, some of which has survived, some of which has not. The thing with metalwork is that even the metalwork that we have in the museum from other parts of the world, we have the metalwork in its latest incarnation because metal can be recycled. We don't know whether metal artworks incorporate previous artworks where the metal's been melted down and reused. So there's probably also a lot of lost artwork just because artworks were remodeled.
Thank you very much. The pieces of Aboriginal artwork, are they attributed to one artist, which is the most recent piece of Aboriginal art museum has acquired, and by whom?
That's a very, very interesting question. The pieces of artwork that you saw, the two pieces were both created by groups of artists from Western Australia. The one with the purple background was created by a group of male artists, and the other one which I showed you with the green and the red. Now, Malcolm, can you see my screen now? Have I started screen sharing?
Yeah, we got the Aztec head on at the moment.
Lovely.
Yeah.
That was created by a group of female artists. So the artworks are often created by gendered groups of artists. Both of them were created by within Aboriginal communities. And what happens is that these artworks are then sold by the art project on behalf of the community. So the monies are then paid back to the community. They are then sold on to galleries who act as agents for these artworks, which is how they are then purchased by anyone who wants to buy one around the world. The two pieces that we saw were both purchased for a 2015 exhibition at the British Museum. So they were specifically purchased to go into this exhibition and then become part of the permanent collection to be representative of modern Aboriginal artworks, and the second one was actually bought with funds from BP. So part of the funding for the exhibition came from BP, and part of that funding, which was paid to the art gallery who had bought the work from the community, came from BP, who then donated it to the British Museum, and it'll now be held by us in perpetuity. So it's a chain of sale that goes from the community, usually through a local art centre or art project, and then on to dealers and agents. And there's a very well-known one in Singapore who specialises in selling artworks on behalf of Aboriginal communities.
Thank you very much. One of our learners has got their hand up, so I'm going to allow them to talk. This is for you, Claire, if you want to ask your question. Hello, Claire. Can we hear you, Claire? Doesn't seem so, does it? Okay. I've got one last question. The Sutton Who burial.
Yes.
Do we know who was buried there?
Oh, now that is another excellent question, because it is a matter of debate. And in fact, even in the time that I have worked at the British Museum, the idea of who was buried at Sutton Hoo has changed. The initial thought was, when it was first recovered and it started to be researched when the objects came out of storage after World War II, was that it may have been the burial of King Redwold, who was an Anglo-Saxon king in Suffolk. That was where his kingdom was based. And there were clues within the burial, such as the fact there are pagan and Christian objects. And Redwold had a temple which had both pagan and Christian altars. He seemed to sort of be hedging his bets with the pagan gods and the newly arrived Christian faith. And it was thought that it therefore might be his high status burial as a king of an Anglo-Saxon kingdom. Nobody has ever been recovered, so it's difficult to actually tell, to be honest, whether it was even male or female, although the grave goods, the things that were deposited with it, do suggest it was a man, not a female, who was buried there. And he's now been slightly downgraded. Nowadays, it's not thought to be Redwold. It's thought to be a high status burial, possibly of a member of the royal household, not Redwold himself. But so far, there has been no evidence recovered from Sutton Hoo or in other sources of the time to indicate exactly who was buried there. Anglo-Saxon, early 600 ADs, probably pagan, definitely high status. But whether we will ever know exactly who it was, at the moment it's highly unlikely. Come back in 100 years and we might have found something. That's the thing with archaeology. You never know what you're going to discover next. But at the moment, I'm afraid, it is a mystery.
Right. Well, thank you very much. That concludes our workshop for today. Just a reminder, we're back on the 1st of March, so 2 weeks off. Thank you very much, Katharine.
Thank you very much. You're most welcome. Goodbye, everyone. Have a lovely Monday. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.